Bapak Wisnu Pamungkas, where are you based at the moment? No. Bapak Wisnu Pamungkas? No. No response. Can we get this director here? I can see somebody from Pascasarjana is here, but I don't know who it is. And lots of people now. We began very slowly, I think because of the storm that we're experiencing here at the moment, which seems to have affected the link. And so people have been introducing themselves. We found a lot of people from all over the world, from China, Switzerland, Liverpool, South Korea, Japan, Queensland, Australia, Leeds, Melbourne, Kendari, and so on. So excellent, And as soon as the director of the graduate school joins us, then we can begin.
Makanya parah banget. Orang sekarang juga hujan parah. Hi, Will.
Hello.
Yeah. I would like to represent Prof. Dedi.
Yeah. Is it Ibu Arita, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So can we begin, Bu Arita?
Yes, I would like to represent Pak Dedi.
Okay.
Okay.
Good. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Zoominar with the theme
Recording in progress.
Language, Society and Education. This takes place once a month, and it's hosted by the Graduate School of Universitas Negeri Jakarta. Every month we have speakers from all over the world, although each semester I try to allocate 40% of the sessions to topics relating to Indonesia. This is the third meeting of this semester, and so far it's the 11th Zoominar that we've held over the last 2 years. Our speaker this afternoon is based at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Prem Fiak, but he comes from Nepal originally. And now Ibu Arita is going to officially open the session. Professor Arita.
Okay, thank you, Haiwal. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Waalaikumsalam. Yeah, distinguished keynote speakers, resource persons, Board of Directors of Postgraduate of Universitas Negeri Jakarta, and participants from many parts of the world. My name is Arita Marini, as Coordinator of Collaboration and Development Center in Postgraduate of UNJ. I am representing the Director to give welcoming remarks in today's session. He is currently on another agenda. This is a new chapter of our international Zoominar. We expect more audiences, especially doctoral degree students, to attend this series of insightful sessions. We hope that it will encourage students to internalize topics discussed by our distinguished speakers and potentially raise the topics for dissertation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our monthly international Zoominar program in 2022 related to language, society, education. What an honor to have you join us in this month's international Zoominar program hosted by Postgraduate of UNJ. The scope of this monthly international program may cover an international level of topics, but we often links it with Indonesian context in the hope of obtaining insights from our international colleagues, as well as providing a discussion platform for our students here in Indonesia and those who are passionate in these topics. Our topic this October is focusing on language policy, language ideology, and social justice, and our respected keynote speakers, Prem Piak from China's University of Hong Kong, have joined us now in this session. Hello, Prem Piak. Good afternoon. He will discuss about the centrality of language ideology in language policy. We also thank Hywel Coleman, who has coordinated the Zoominar and in charge of being our moderator for this session. Once again, thank you very much for allocating your time to speak in our session today, Prem Piak. Without further ado, I wish you a fruitful discussion and thank you for your attendance and participation in this month's International Zoominar program. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you, Prof. Arbiter. So let's begin. Without further ado, can I ask you please to turn off your cameras and your microphones, because the link is very poor. If you have questions or comments, can you put them in the chat box, please? Our speaker has to leave promptly at the end of the hour. That means that he will have now about 30 minutes for presentation and then about 15 minutes for discussion at the end. Okay, Bram.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Hywel, and thank you, Professor Arbiter and everyone for coming. So I will be talking about language policy, language ideology, and social justice. And of course, it's a very broad topic, but I would just like to basically trace the history of language policy and planning as a field and where we are basically heading to, and also discuss briefly about the centrality of language ideology and why it matters in researching language policy and planning. And finally, I will discuss, how social justice is important concept in language policy and planning and why is it important. So basically, my talk focuses on these three different concepts: language policy, language ideology, and social justice. I will draw, my examples are mostly from Nepal because that's the place where I basically focus my research on. But of course, my theoretical discussions are drawn from different parts of the world. So what counts as policy? So there are different interpretations of policy, right? I really like this idea of policy, different dimensions, a different perspective to define policy by Stephen Ball, who is not really talking about language policy, but he talks about education policy. But the whole idea of the policy is very contested, and there are very different perspectives about policy. So Stephen Ball defined policy from very different perspectives. For example, policy as a text, so which includes written laws, rules, regulations, basically, for example, constitution and education acts and policies. But policy is not only text, it can be a discourse as well. So he draws on Foucault's ideas of the discourse as practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak, and discourses are not about objects. They do not identify objects, rather they constitute them in the practice of doing so, conceal their own invention. So basically, language policy are discourses, so what can be said and thought, but also about who can speak when, where, and with what authority. So basically, it's not always written, but it can also be seen as a discourse, right? He also talks about policy effects. So policy as a text, policy as a discourse. But what is important to see is how policy has different impacts, different impacts on the life of people from different backgrounds, right? So also there is ongoing discussion, a number of studies on policy as a practice. So how people from different cultural groups have very developed normative practices from bottom up without, without having any explicit policies. As the practices form policies. So with this this kind of broader perspective of what counts as a policy, let's go back to early conceptualization of language policy and planning. So if we go back to early history of language policy and planning, so we go back to 1950s by Einar Haugen, who introduced the term language planning. But basically, he defines it as the activity of preparing a normative orthography, grammar, dictionary for the guidance of writers and speakers in non-homogeneous speech community. As you see that it's more about standardization, language policy as the project of standardization. And at the same time, just after that, I'm not sure, this is very interesting history, a book to read that traces the history, actually builds the foundation of language policy and planning. The book edited by Rubin and Gernard, Can Languages Be Planned? Sociolinguistic Theory and Practices for Developing Nation at the University of Hawaii, actually, I think at the East-West Center of Hawaii. So they sociolinguists like Joshua Fishman, Rubin, Joan Rubin, and Jorn Gernard, Das Gupta. So they have really interesting chapters in the book. And basically this book focuses on language planning as nation building project. So Rubin and Gernard basically draw on Malaysian example, and they talk about language planning as the goal of language planning is to develop enrich national language, promote literacy talents, especially in the national language, to print and publish and assist the printing or publication of books, magazine, pamphlets, and other forms of literature in the national language as well as in the other languages, and standardize the spelling and pronunciation, and to coin appropriate terminologies in national language, and to publish a national language dictionary. So as you see that the early conceptualization of language planning and policies, it's all about nation building and standardization. So with this, Kaplan and Baldoff in 1997 defined language policy and planning as a body of ideas, laws, regulations, rules, and practices intended to achieve the plan language change in the society's group or system. And again, it's more like explicit language policy as a text. So, but as you see, there are different interpretation of language policy. For example, Schiffman defines language policy as a social construct. So, which means language policy is not just explicit in nature, involving judicial, administrative, constitutional, and legal language, but they also include very implicit cultural constructs such as belief system, attitudes, myths, and the whole complex that we are referring to as a linguistic culture. So, which is the sum totality of ideas, values, belief, attitudes, prejudices, even religious strictures, and all the other cultural baggage that speakers bring to their dealings with language from their background. So it's more like language policy as a linguistic culture. So how we develop normative practices is not always explicit, but also guided by our belief system, attitudes, and needs, and depending on our background. So, but again, in 1991, Jim Tollefson wrote a book, Planning Language, Planning Inequalities, Language Plan Policy in the Community. So basically, this book actually set up the whole discourse So now popularly known as critical language policy. So which sees language policy and planning as a power mechanism, right? So which means language planning and policy kind of creates distinction among social groups, right, or classes. So that is, policy is one mechanism for locating language within social structure, so that language determines who has access to political power and economic resources. And language policy is one mechanism by which dominant groups establish hegemony in language use. So Tollefson is very critical about how language policy and planning reproduce dominant ideologies and hegemony of dominant languages. So in other words, it's power mechanism, right? So there is an increasing developments, new perspectives in language planning and policy. For example, Teresa McCarthy edited a volume called Ethnography of Language Policy, which characterizes language policy as a complex socio-cultural process, so which includes modes of human interaction, negotiation, and production mediated by relations of power. So in this sense, like policy resides in their language regulating power. That is the ways in which they express normative claims about legitimate and illegitimate language forms and uses, thereby governing language status and use. So basically, it's about, it's a very bottom-up perspective. So how people from different cultural groups engage in the process of interaction, negotiation, and production of the mediated language practices by relations of their power. So in sum, language policy is always a mechanism that impacts the structure, function, use, or acquisition of language, and includes varieties of domains. For example, official regulations, but also unofficial, very covert, de facto, and implicit mechanisms that are connected to beliefs, practices, and powers over language use. Also, not always products. It also involves processes. For example, policy is a verb, not always noun. In other words, language policies are influenced by diversity of language policy agents, for example, right? There is no single person who is creating a policy. So there are multiple people representing different backgrounds. So it's always a process, right? Which involves a lot of tensions ideologically and sometimes in practical sense as well. So policy, texts, and discourses are always, or in other words, policies are always multi-layered and the layer phenomenon. So it travels through different spaces, different levels of power, for example, government to communities, schools, teachers. So, and in the process of this traveling, so there are so many interpretations, sometimes not really aligning with the original intent of the policies, right? So I really like this Cooper's, although it is dated 1989. So what counts as very basic idea of language policy is what actors attempt to influence which behaviors of which people and what ends, under which conditions, by what means, throughout what decision-making processes, with what effect. So it's all about language policy. So who are the actors of whom, and what is the purpose, and in what conditions, and what are the means, and how the decisions are made, and what are the impacts of those decisions, right? So with this, let me briefly, this is what I have put things together based on Recento. If we really go back to history of language policy and planning, so there are so many developments, but I kind of like organize all these developments in 4 different, not really clearly distinctive, but I would say like more kind of overlapping manner, right? So, for example, in 1960s, the neoclassical approaches basically focused on nation states, nation building, modernization, focusing on corpus planning, status planning, acquisition planning. So the purpose was basically solving the problem. There are a number of scholars who contributed to this effort. But in 70s and 80s, in 70s and 80s. So people started questioning on this whole ideology of nation building and modernization, and basically because it was like more one nation, one language ideology. So, and there was a more socio-linguistic movement, for example, for example, Hornberger and Delheim, Labov, they basically ask a question about how language policy, basically macro language policy, represents socially situated practices, right? So that's what they started questioning. It's more like focusing on ethnography of speaking and social interaction, not necessarily focusing on what the nation states think about, right? And that led to this emergence of historical structural approach. In other words, critical language policy, the work of, for example, Lippy Green and Pennycook, Philipson, Tollefson, so who basically started questioning the language policy as a nation building project. So how are they contributing to promoting diversity, particularly indigenous languages, local languages, and minority languages, right? So in other words, they started seeing language policy and planning, particularly as more like the tool to build language hierarchies and stratification of society. For example, Philipson questioned the global expansion of English as a linguistic imperialism, right? So, and again, that led to, if in 2000 on, or it's a more like the emergence of the public sphere approach. So which basically draws on Habermas's communicative theory. But basically, people started asking the question about how this notion of like globalization and neoliberalism, the expansion of English and dominant languages actually contribute to promoting and preserving local languages, for example, right? So more like the language rights, right, and language preservation, and for that it's really important to participate in understanding power relations and talking about how people are impacted by language policy and planning, right? So it's really important to talk about that, how policies are explicitly and implicitly, affecting the lives of people. So it's more like interacting with the public, right? And 2010 onwards, so it's more like continuation of the public sphere approach, but I call it like more counter publics, or in other words, engaged language policy. So although there is the growing expansion of neoliberal ideologies and global expansion of, for example, English, and even the local national languages, for example, it's really important to think from more counter public perspective. So in other words, counter public basically refers to the voices of minority, indigenous people whose languages have been historically marginalized for long. So they are increasing, voice to see language policy and planning from these communities' perspective. So basically, more like thinking about participation, social transformation, countering and transforming the ideological hegemony that we have been part of for long, should be actually at the center of language policy research. So there are different approaches that people, the scholars from around the world have contributed. For example, focusing on critical consciousness raising, participatory action research, working with indigenous communities. That is what I'm basically focusing on later. So with this sketch, Ricento has contributed kind of three different broader dimensions of analyzing history of language planning and policy. For example, macro sociopolitical factors, so it could be national or international condition, micro migration, economic policies. Language policy and planning also carries certain paradigms of knowledge, for example, structuralism, modernism, postmodernism. but there are what is important is we also need to consider strategic factors. So what are the goals of each language policy or policies, right? And what are the objectives and how do they really impact on the lives of people? So just to recapitulate, the early 1960s, you can see that it was more about the standardization of languages, status planning, corpus planning, and acquisition planning. And then the question by scholars like Dale Himes from more sociolinguistic perspective and focusing on speech communities. Now, how do they interact, negotiate languages? And the third stage more like historical structural approach or critical language policy, like Philipson's questioning the expansion of English, basically. How I really like this notion of discursive effects of English, right? So in other words, so we have taken the different discourses related to English as a global language or English as a language of international market or job opportunity, all these things, it's very deeply. So how do we question this discursive effect if we are really interested in promoting multilingualism and diversity? Also this notion of linguicism, in other words, linguistic racism. So any ideology and structure, beliefs and practices that support linguistic discrimination should be questioned, right? And of course, language policies have been always the field, to understand how language and racism are actually interconnected. So that leads us to really think about the centrality of language ideology, which basically refers to assumption, beliefs, and attitudes about language. And language ideologies are always socio-cultural, political, and economic conditions. So, for example, I started questioning the relevance of English-only policy in standard English language ideologies, and also linguistic hegemonies of both national or international languages. So then this recently there is a growing scholarship in the field of language policy. For example, how different policies, not only national but also institutional policies, for example, universities, schools, sometimes even the family, how their policies impact on the lives of people differently. And Sandra Dobson's work, for example, draws on Skudnab Konga's idea of linguicism and talks about linguistic racism as the discriminatory practices based on individuals' use of language, accent, dialect, repertoire, and species, right? So this is very interesting special issue on linguistic racism. So again, now from 1980s, 19th onwards, so there is a growing discourse on language rights and seeing, for example, mother tongue as a right to get education and preserve ethno-linguistic identities. Also, language policy and planning seen as a mechanism to produce socio-political and ethno-technical inequalities. And basically, globally, it's a way to promote Westernization and modernization ideologies, particularly through dominance of English and Western textbook teaching methods and cultures, for example. So now there is a growing tendency to see language policy from more ethnographic perspective. So it basically refers to expansion of the domains of language policy, not only government business, but also seeing, for example, workplace, social media, the family, and see how people interact, how people use their agency to create their own policies, and what are the tensions and how do they negotiate different ideologies in the processes of language policy creations. So there are different agents. So language policy is as an agency practice, right, which includes teachers, parents, students, politicians, depending on the domains where we are talking about language policies. So this talk leads us to looking into the ecology of language approach. So how languages are used as part of our ecological diversity in different communities. So ethnography of language policy basically is a very interesting metaphor, an onion metaphor, which which basically tells us that language policy is always multi-layered. So we can't really understand the objectives, impacts, ideologies of language policy without unpacking or unpeeling these layers of the onion. So, but it's also important to really focus on agency in language policy, right? This book by Bouchard and Glasgow really talk about how people, how different actors, language policy actors, different stakeholders have their power to act, for example, to appropriate, to manipulate, to negotiate and reinterpret, and sometimes even resist and create new policies, right? So that's more like agency. So Johnson and Johnson talk about language policy arbiter. So to understand how people have agency to manipulate, to interpret, and to appropriate language policies. For example, just to give an example of language education policy or educational language policy. So the state may have one policy, and then there may be different arbiters, for example, Department of Education people who may have very different interpretation and understanding of policy, and the teachers or district officers may have very different interpretation, and the teachers may have very different interpretations of language policy. So when language policy travels from macro, meso to micro, so there are very different interpretations. So we need to see language policy not as a linear process. It's more like agentive, contested, and with very multiple outcomes and interpretation at the end. So let me go to very quickly. So in order to understand language policy and planning from very different perspectives, Spolsky's this three-dimension approach has been very popularly used. For example, language management. So language policy involves language management. How people use languages, how they manage languages, and how do they put efforts, and what are the resources they have, and how do they make rules and control choices of languages, right? And so language ideology is at the center that Spolsky recognizes. So it basically refers to assumption, beliefs, values about languages and language practices, and that it actually mediates how we use language with what are the broader socioeconomic power and political conditions. Spolsky also talks about language practices. We need to see how people actually use languages, right? From bottom up in different places, in different institutions. So with this, let me focus on language ideology. So what it is and why it matters. So Blomart and Pennycook, particularly critical applied linguists and critical language policy scholars talk about language and language policy as ideological. So Pennycook has actually highlighted that it's not language that matters in language policy, but it's language ideology that is at the center of language policies. So it basically refers to a set of beliefs about language articulated by users as a rationalization or justification of perceived language structure and use that Mike Silverstone, linguistic anthropology, defines. So language ideologies always represent identities, cultural values, and political economic beliefs, power relations, attitudes about language, and sense of belonging. So it could be in the positive and negatives. Language ideologies could be inclusive or discriminatory, monolingual or multilingual, monoglossic or heteroglossic. It's kind of like sometimes standard or non-standard. So with this, language ideology can be defined in many ways. For example, Silverstone defined as a rationalization or justification of a perceived language structure. Heath defines it as a self-evident ideas or objectives or group holds concerning the role of language. Judith Irvine defines it as a cultural system of ideas about social and linguistic relationship, together with their loading of moral and political interest. And Ramsey defines it as a shared bodies of common sense notion. So basically, language ideologies are seen as kind of general assumptions and beliefs about the language rules and practices, right? So where is the place of language ideology? So when you see the society from a more anthropological perspective, so we see that there is a structure and we have agency. So structure expects something from us to do, right? And then agency, the individuals or the group can create, interpret, and appropriate and implement policies in different ways. So there is always kind of dialectic relationship between structure and agency, but ideology actually mediates the structure and agency. So we all act with certain interest, right? And that interest basically emerges from our assumptions and values about languages, right? So the language ideology is more like mediating tool between structure and agency. So let me focus on the two dominant language ideologies that we that has very long history in language policy and planning, but still makes really critical sense in order to understand how language policies at local, national, and international level are not really being more inclusive in many ways. Of course, there are inclusive practices as well. So one dominant ideology is linguistic nationalism. So the book, the idea of imagined community that Benedict Anderson wrote, a lot of example of course, Indonesia. So which basically talks about how languages are, how a language is used as a nationalist tool, right, to homogenize people as a common group, right? So the ideology that we need one language for our national identity is very dominant. And in other words, like the one nation, one state ideology actually shapes our assumptions about what counts as national language, and right. So this is very deeply rooted in our discourses and minds and the history of nationalism, of course. For example, in the context of Nepal, in media and in the impersonal interactions, we can always see that, okay, you should speak Nepali because you are a Nepali citizen, right? Speak a standard language, speak a pure language. So this leads us to really another related ideology, that is standard language ideology. So Regina Lippigren wrote an interesting book on English with an accent, which basically talks about how standard language ideology reproduces actually the language practices of the dominant group, mostly upper class and elites, right? So it's not really something that is linguistically reasonable, but it's more like class, justification. It's more like power relations, right? So it's very strong ideology still, right? When there are uses of indigenous and ethnic minority languages, or for example, accented version of national language, and we are often questioned, right? And people are often questioned. So it's very deep linguistic nationalism. And of course, globally speaking, so this ideology of neoliberalism, so which basically is there are different interpretations of neoliberalism, but basically it's about privatization, state deregulation, free market economy, competition, choice, right? So these discourses actually shape our understanding about what counts as legitimate language, right, in language policies across the domain, for example, in education, in the job market, and the workplace, so on. So basically, this ideology reproduces the capital of dominant language, and sometimes, of course, the national language and international language. And as we see, this ideology commodifies the languages. And for example, in the case of Nepal, like I can give example of how English becomes the medium of instruction, and it kind of discursively indexes education as quality, or English medium education as quality education. So consequently, indigenous and ethnic minority languages are displaced from schools, and it leads to issues concerning linguistic racism, exclusion, and lack of access to resources, particularly for indigenous and ethnic minority children in education and the public sphere. So this leads to this idea of the social justice. As you see that there is growing interest in questioning how nation states language policies, not only nation state, but language policies across domains, particularly in the context of neoliberalism, kind of excludes or displaces the minority languages, indigenous languages. So recent studies have really looked into how neoliberalism continued to reproduce historical, socio-political, and linguistic inequalities, right? For example, Pillar's work shows that linguistic justices are linked with social inequalities as they affect the parity of participation of indigenous and minoritized people in different spheres of life, education, workplace, and policy-making process. Particularly, critical applied linguists have argued the lack of inclusive language education policy that contributes to erasure of epistemological diversities, and which Spivak uses as a form of epistemic violence, and Santos calls it as an epistemicide to interpret how dominant discourses and policies disregard the knowledge of the historically marginalized people. So I'm basically interested in very specific notion, dimension of social justice, which Miranda Fricker calls epistemic injustice. For her, epistemic injustice basically refers to a wrong done to someone, especially in their capacity as a knower. Fricker describes the notion of epistemic injustice as follows. So, quote, "My chief purpose in invoking the label was to delineate a distinctive class of wrongs, namely those in which someone is ingeniously downgraded and or disadvantaged in respect to their status as an epistemic subject. Our first point to make is that this kind of epistemic injustice is fundamentally a form of direct or indirect discrimination." So basically what happens in the policy-making process is, a certain group of people, so particularly those who speak minority or indigenous languages, are not really seen as a knower. In other words, they are not seen as an epistemic subject, right? So because most often in the context of Nepal, so their consciousness, their historical struggles and activism is misframed. Sometimes like they are, for example, in regards to mother tongue education or multilingual education, most often indigenous and indigenous communities are kind of described as unaware subjects or unaware communities. So most often when there is a debate on why multilingual education, why mother tongue education is not really implemented more effectively, so one common thread that emerges is that, okay, the communities are not aware of their own language issues. So in other words, this kind of deficit view downgrades them as non-epistemic being, right? But historically they have been preserving their languages, they have been struggling to create spaces for their languages, and this kind of struggle is not seen as a knowledge or epistemology in the process of language policy making. So that's why Nancy Fraser actually uses this term of misframing. So basically, misframing occurs when certain groups of people are wrongly denied equal participation and their perspectives are distorted in decision-making processes. In the reproduction of epistemic injustice, misframing disallows certain epistemologies and identities as a legitimate part of language education policies, for example. So quite often their voices are misframed in the making of language policies, right? So, for example, I have seen in the context of Nepal that, most parents talk about like, okay, we need English, right? English is important language. Of course, you need to learn English, and we all need to learn English, or even the national language. But it doesn't mean that you don't have to learn, or you have to displace, or schools have to displace or erase the teaching and learning and the use of mother tongue indigenous languages. So quite often this misframing happens in the process of language policy making processes, and that leads to, in general, social injustice, or more particularly epistemic injustice, right? So this leads us to this idea of engaged language policy. So what should be done? So basically in 2017, Kathy Davis and I wrote a book So which we call like engaged language policy and practices, ELP in short. But basically we focus on now, okay, these are the issues in language policy and planning. And of course, we need to be aware of critical issues. But at the same time, we need to really think about awareness raising in the grassroots initiatives as well, and focusing more on community engagement and bottom up. And it's really important to see how we can make people who have struggled historically for long as an ideological subject. In other words, so the being aware of ideologies of language policy and planning, how they discriminate against their languages and knowledge. So the book, so we basically focus on how we work with youths in analyzing language policies, and also working with teachers, schools to address their policies and develop alternative policies, mostly multilingual practices and indigenous languages. And this idea of participatory action research projects with schools, teachers, and communities in understanding language policy, the impacts of language policies, discourses of language policies, and how they create inequalities and how can we address them. It's more like small scale projects, but they make really good impacts in transforming policies from the bottom up. So, and it's really interesting book, community-based research in language policy and planning, recently published. So, but it's really, I really think that we really need to focus on engagement, not as someone, as a researcher who observes, language policy and practices, but we really need to engage community in the process of doing research, mostly through dialogue, or there are different forms of engagement. We need to listen to the voices of the community and plan activities collaboratively. And we need to see community as agents and epistemic subjects. So quite often what happens is in language policy research, we analyze policies, but we hardly, work collaboratively with the communities and see how they can play really agentive roles and what knowledges they can bring. So they are not often actually seen in the discussion, in the scholarship of language policy and planning. So my contribution, my argument is that, of course, we have actually now language policy and planning has been it has grown up, right? It has been a really wide area of research, but it's still, it's really important for all of us to go back to the community and see how language policies, not just policy of the government, but different policies that we have created in schools, even in the family. So how do they impact on the lives of people, and how can we see these communities as agents, epistemic subjects to change, to create, to recreate policies that addresses their knowledge, that addresses their identities and historical struggles. So that's it. That is at the center of engaged language policy. And at the center of engaged language policy is, of course, ideological becoming. So we need to start with ideologies and understanding ideologies, but not the researchers understanding ideologies, but helping participants or agents, or helping communities understand the ideologies that shape their own ideologies at the same time and practices, and have been contributing to reproduce inequalities for long. So we begin with more like ideological awareness, and that would lead to more like action-oriented transformation on the ground. So I think I end here. Thank you for listening to me. So if you have any questions, so I can take some questions for maybe 10 minutes. Thank you, Howell, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Prem. That's a really, really interesting and very rich overview of the field. I've learned a lot from that presentation, and especially the later parts where you talked about involving people in analyzing their own language context in a critical way. That's really fascinating. I can see that Martin Bedell has made a comment. Martin, would you like to say something? Martin, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still there. But I didn't think I'd actually sent it yet.
Well,
Hang on.
I read
I mean, it seemed, I mean, I think what I found very illuminating was just how language policy matters, because actually it influences directly or indirectly every one of us in our experience of the languages, the language or languages that we use or encounter. And therefore, because language is such a fundamental factor in being a human being, actually language policy really influences our experiences of being a human being.
Yeah, Prem, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's really good observation, Martin. And I don't think that there is any phenomenon in our life that is not really linked with language, right? So language, most often, I don't think that we have in language policy, we haven't really studied much about how language policy impacts, right? Explicit or implicit normative practices impacts on the lives of people and ourselves, right? In many ways. So for example, it begins with family language policy, right? So how, for example, I'm not sure how many of us remember that how we were told by our parents to speak, right? In particular way, or not to use one language or use just that or this language, right? So, and even the workplace, right? So how do we feel safe? Do we feel safe in talking or using a specific language? Same thing happens in schools, for example. How do children feel safe in terms of like participating in interaction, talking with their colleagues, friends, and teachers? So there is a kind of like explicit or implicit normative practices that we have created for long. And we really need to understand that if we really, in Nancy Fraser's term, like parity of participation, we should really focus on that. Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important observation, Marty. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad.
Thanks. There's a question from Devon Derrickson. Devon, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's a link between neoliberalism in the economy and language education. Is it only an issue of commodification, or are there other ideological factors involved? Here in South Korea, the government policy on English learning actually has less of an impact on what we're doing at the university level than the hiring policies of the large corporations.
Yeah, I think neoliberalism works differently in different contexts. And of course, as a global ideology, it's a free market. State deregulation, of course, choice and competition. It works in different contexts in different ways for me. But just to speak of speaking of Nepal's context, for example, right? So we have like private and public schools. And then these private schools are not really accountable. I mean, they can have their own policies, right? Language policies, and mostly English as a medium of instruction. And that becomes like a kind of a selling point, right? A selling resource to have more students and for making profit, basically, right? Of course. And the state does not regulate. I mean, it's because it's, but state creates a neoliberal policy in general, right? But on the other hand, the public schools are because they are public schools, right? So they have to follow the constitutions, they have to follow the rules, and you can already see that this neoliberal divisive policy creates hierarchy of languages, right? Those who go to English medium private schools see themselves as having more prestige, right, than those who really go to public schools where English is not a medium of instruction. But I would say it's more ideological, right? I don't think that there is any practical, like, for example, for example, if you don't go to English medium of instruction, schools with English medium of instruction, you are not intelligent, right? There is no correlation with English medium of instruction and intelligence or quality of education. But it's very deeply rooted ideologies that we have, right? Because we associate, as you have said, English with economy, English with money, English with job market, right? It doesn't have to be always in higher education or education. It can be in other spaces as well. So yeah, I think it depends largely on how people, how different countries and different contexts actually appropriate use of neoliberalism. But quite often, one fundamental common ideologies or strategies that policy makers use is this whole discourse of competition, right? You need to compete with this and that actors, right? And also choice, right? You have a choice, right? You have a choice to use to have like English or other local medium of instruction, and at that ends up with more like state deregulation. So you can do whatever you would like to do. So, and that basically is more like not really addressing linguistic diversity or issues of participation, discrimination, and historical injustices. So in other words, I would say that, like, although neoliberalism is like something that is seen at the surface, but it actually it's a tool to carry on historical inequalities that we have. Yeah. So nobody can question, like, okay, what happens if I don't learn English? I don't get job. Like you don't really question, right? So, but it's more ideological. I don't think that there are many people who get job without English as well. And another discourse is that it's not only English that you need for the job. Like you need to know English, you need to have English proficiency and English knowledge, of course, but you need to have other languages, other language proficiency as well. For example, that would be more. Yeah, I think that's a good question. Thank you.
Thanks. So your response reminded me of some work that I've been doing here on English medium of instruction policy in higher education, together with colleagues from Leeds and from 3 Indonesian universities, and we've been looking at the myths that underlie the introduction of this policy, the beliefs that people have about the benefits of EMI. One of which is that the quality of the education will be better if it's delivered through the medium of English. I'm conscious of time. There's just, I think, time for maybe one last question from Ibu.
I can take 2 questions, Howell, if you like.
Go on.
Yeah. So somebody has asked, I think, Siusana. I'm sorry if I pronounce your name wrongly. So you. So what is the epistemological factor, I think, in relation to postmodernism? So basically it's all about, if as I presented, like the early history of language policy and planning begins with nation building process. Actually, one nation, one language. You have to, for example, Robin and Jordan, of course, they did a wonderful job. They set up the foundation of language policy and planning, but still, if you look at how they frame language policy and planning, is all about promoting a national language, right? It's more like modernist project, right? Uniformity, standardization, and nationalism. But postmodernism basically challenges that, and then there are different epistemological orientations. Languages is not just about nationalism. So there are other knowledges, other values as well, right? For example, languages links with identity, languages links with discrimination, so participation. So it's not just like that nationalism that matters, when we talk about language policy, right? So yeah, that's it. And there is nothing like one center of language policy. It's not just nation state that creates language policy. Now there are different centers, right? For example, even the family, even schools, right? The teachers make their own policies. I have taught in schools, and I was told by my school to teach to use this and that language, but I understand my students were struggling and I was struggling. So I use multiple languages, not just English, for example. I was teaching in a private school, for example. So there is nothing like one center of language policy creation, imposition, and implementation. There are multiple centers. So if we see language policy as more like a field, we don't really see it as one-centric or monocentric. So that's all about, of course, modernism, but postmodernism is all about seeing it as a more polycentric, phenomenon. Of course, very contested. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Prem. I think we have to.
And there is another question linguistic landscape. Oh yeah, this is very interesting question. So I'm sure that I can just refer to one book by Alana Sohami, who writes about language policy, and basically she talks about different mechanisms of language policy. And linguistic landscape, the language used in public places, for example, signboards and commercial billboards, even restaurants, supermarkets, street signs. All these languages are actually one of the mechanisms or major mechanism that actually tell us so many things about language policies, because the creators of those languages, the languages that are made visible in public spaces have, of course, a number of maybe have many people involved, or there are different processes of making decisions, for example. So which languages should be used in public places? For example, government signboards, right? And how do supermarkets decide the use of languages in their signboards, for example? So linguistic landscape is, of course, is a wonderful new area to analyze, to interpret language policy. Actually, I'm teaching language policy and planning course here, and one of my course projects for my students is they have to go out to the street and collect images and analyze the language used in public spaces from language policy and planning perspectives here in Hong Kong. So yeah, of course, yeah, definitely, it's a really interesting area. So there is another question from Mia. How about relationship between language education for pre-graduate children about ideology or language policy? I'm not sure about this question, but when I say language ideology, it's not like monolithic, concept. Different people have very different ideologies. I may have very different ideology about English, and you may have very different ideologies of English, but these ideological concepts are not really neutral. So they are shaped by our cultural background, so where we come from and what are our imagined futures and real or imagined futures. So all those things. So it largely depends on who are these graduate children and what are their goals. Yeah.
Okay. I think time is up. You have to go off and teach, I think.
Yeah, I have a class. I have to walk down to campus and teach. Okay, there is a question, so I can take Howell so quickly. So what is the difference between Indonesian policy language and your country? I think I don't know much about Indonesian. Maybe Howell, maybe you may have more insights on this question. So, but anyway, so thank you very much, Howell, again, and I'm really honored to share what I know about language policy and planning. And of course, it's more like very general, but we can definitely keep talking and have this conversation going on in the future as well. So thank you, Howell.
Thank you very much indeed. Wonderful presentation. We had an audience of 250 people, which is excellent, from all over the world. Thanks very much indeed.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
If anybody's still there, the next session will be on the 16th of November. And unusually, this will be a Wednesday. Usually our presentations are on Thursdays, and it will start half an hour earlier than usual, but I'll send a notice round as usual about the next session. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thank you, Howell.
Recording.